Good afternoon, and welcome to the final presentation of the 2023 Within Health Summit. My name is you making me laugh. My name is Jamie Singletary, and I am the Director of Clinical Brand Development for Within Health. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wendy Oliver-Pyatt, co-founder, Chief Executive Officer, Chief Medical Officer of Within Health, and Galen Hope. Before I turn it over to Dr. Pyatt, I just want to go over those very important housekeeping rules that we've been going over all week as it pertains to your CE and CME credits. I will put my contact in the chat should you have any problems getting your certificate. We also encourage you to utilize the chat feature for any questions, concerns regarding today's talk and comments. We also will be giving away a book that ours truly, Dr. Wendy Oliver-Pyatt wrote. So if you are engaging in the chat, we do have a little raffle that we are going to do behind the scenes, and we are going to be giving away Dr. Pyatt's book. It is called Questions and Answers on Binge Eating Disorder, a Guide for Clinicians. So without further ado, it is my pleasure, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Wendy Oliver-Pyatt speaking on the evolution of shame, origin, understanding, and healing. Take it away, Dr. Pyatt.
Thank you. Wow, I'm so excited that this is we're wrapping up this interesting week. So grateful to everybody who helped organize this interesting week, and I'm really appreciative of people who participated this week. It's a really unique week where we just are doing things different. The point being is that we don't want to preach to the choir. We want to bring in other, domains out there in the world. And that's what we've been doing with the summit. And we've been really welcomed with open arms across so many different programs and organizations. It's been really, really great. So it just I'm blown away by it. And I thank you all so much. I have the honor of being able to do the last presentation of the summit, and this is a subject that is very, I think it's very relevant and very important, and I feel like it doesn't get enough airtime. And that subject is a subject of shame, and shame affects so many different mental health struggles, certainly eating disorders and addictions, but it's a ubiquitous emotion, and sometimes it can really get the best of us and really cause great harm. It can get burrowed down inside our soul and leave us like very isolated and in pain. And it's something that, in order to have good treatment working, we have to get into the shame. So it's a subject that is a little awkward sometimes to talk about. But I think putting it out there is like the first step. I'll share something that is kind of interesting. I was giving a talk at this conference in Costa Mesa called Emergence, and I thought I was going to use this PowerPoint that I have today here prepared. But once I got to the conference, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we're not using PowerPoints. We're just going to ad lib. We're using no PowerPoints at this talk." And I was like, "Oh my God, going to give a talk without a PowerPoint," and it ended up being really interesting because we ended up sort of having a process group, around shame. So depending on our time, we'll see if we can weave in some of that experiential. I will be sure to stop on time, and feel free to put any questions or ideas or comments into the chat. And then depending on how many questions and such there is, I'll stop somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. So this is like really the first time I've ever given this talk. So I'll be kind of figuring out how the pace is going. But it's something that's very, very important to me. I remember when I first was in the beginning of my eating disorder, and I was talking to my older brother, and I brought up like that I was feeling a lot of shame. And I remember he said, "Shame sucks." And I was like, wow, that was kind of refreshing. I'm glad he put it like that. Shame can really wreak havoc on us. And it's just important, I think, to learn about it and talk about it. So here we go. There's been a lot of, writings about shame that go way back, really back to Darwin era. And there's some cultural theories. And then I'm going to talk about what's called interpersonal needs and shame bind that I think is very, very interesting. We're going to talk about some of the functions of shame. We're going to just be able to discriminate between shame and guilt. We're going to talk about a subject that I find very interesting, which is the connection between shame and altruism. That's just my own little personal sort of interesting thing nugget to talk about. And we're going to also talk about shame, weight, stigma, and eating disorders. So the definition and where the word actually came from is from an old English word, scamu. And it really is tied in with like a painful feeling of guilt or disgrace, dishonor, insult. So these are some of the terms from the very earliest writing. It sort of had that weaving in of disgrace, and really about your reputation and your loss of esteem and modesty. So, but really early writings had to do with this like sense of dishonor and disgrace, and it's morphed a little bit over time. So you can look back, going back to the 1250s, it was to put something or someone or something to shame. The early writing, you see it relating to put something to shame. So you inflict disgrace or dishonor upon. And then later on, it was more tied into shyness and modesty. For shame, like you should be ashamed. And then it got into the person that needed to be ashamed of themselves. And then 1947, more recently, we started hearing about shame culture. I think shame culture is sadly alive and well. What it was so interesting to kind of research this book. Darwin's 1872 book, The Expressions of the Emotions of Man and Animals. It's the first study in which the science of psychology started to get spoken about. It's kind of hard to imagine this, but just that concept of emotional expression, like the idea of emotions and emotional expression, there wasn't any language for it. It wasn't spoken about. It's just kind of odd to think about because we have so many different words for different emotions. But in 1872 was when we first started hearing, really seeing the science of psychology. So Darwin is thought of, in a certain way having to do with, evolution. But here we are finding out that he was very interested in the expression of emotions. So he thought about it in a few different ways. The serviceable associated habits is sort of like you do something that is a habit that is associated with something else. And if you don't do it, there's a sense of shame. And the principle of antithesis is that you want to do the thing that's the opposite of shame. You've got to always stay in the opposite. And then the principle of action is really tied into the nervous system, which is very interesting. It kind of has to do with habit. And you see this, the example I read about is a dog that, have you seen how the dogs like go in circles and circles and circles before they sit down and they dig with their feet. So they're doing something that's a habit that's related to probably some earlier stored need, like being in the bush or that sort of thing. So this is a little bit about how behavior and emotions kind of times together in the current state, but it's not really understood why, but there was a why. So this is really about evolutionary biology and emotion that Darwin was beginning to talk about, which I just thought that was so interesting. And so Darwin was talking about observations of shame, and he observed the eyes being turned from side to side, blushing, looking to the ground, lowered lips, corners of the lips, downward head movement, covering the face, avoidance, closed body posture, and a sort of contraction of the body. This is from Heidi Baybaum in The Descent of Shame. So these physiological associations, which we certainly see that as well. And so what's kind of interesting is to think about some of the social function of shame, and it may perform an adaptive function in that it maintains social norms and behaviors. So there's a very aversive effect of social rejection. We do things that are sort of out of order. So shame, is like keeping us in line. And in fact, is associated with feelings of disgust towards the self. If you read about On the Origins of Shame by Teresi, which was very, very interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about that disgust piece as well, which is something I think that really comes up in the pain of shame, is that feeling of disgust toward the self, and is very tied in with, I think, some of the emotions that people experience, when they're experiencing eating disorders. And I try to remind folks that sometimes a person that's restricting is really restricting because they're avoiding that shame spiral or that sense of disgust that they feel after they eat. I remember a very well-known psychiatrist was telling me that people with anorexia nervosa just don't enjoy food. And I was like, well, this is where lived experience and clinical experience can come in very handy. And it isn't really about the person not enjoying food, but a big piece of this is the feeling post-eating. And it's very important to understand that clinically, what the person is really going through in terms of the behaviors that are driven by shame. And this is also, this statement from Heidi Maybaum is really also tied into what we see in diet culture, right? The most common view of shame is that it's an intensely negative emotion directed at the self. So an intensely negative emotion, it's directed at the self. And it's, I failed to live up to some standard ideal or norm. So it's that sense of failure and that sense of what the norm is. So diet culture creates a very rigid sense of what's acceptable, with regard to your body. And this is horrible because our body is our one gift from God. It's the one thing that is of our own. It's our own to care for. It's our own to, help us get through the world day in and day out. And when we internalize this sense of shame about this body of ours, it's a very, very intense experience. That's why, eating disorders are so misunderstood. So often you hear things like, oh, she's just being controlling, or there was actually in the previous DSM, previous to the DSM-5, which really pissed me off, it said that anorexia nervosa was like a refusal. They used the word refusal to eat, a refusal to gain weight, according to what the body needed. It's not a refusal. It's a reaction. It's an adaptation very often to this emotion of shame. Eating disorders, addictions, there's burrowed shame in there pretty much every single time. And that's why just behavioral protocols, jump through this, jump, come to my program. I'm going to tell you to do this. I'm going to put guardrails up. You're going to do that. Then you're going to leave. If we don't go into the underlying emotion, like, of course, the person's not going to be able to sustain their recovery. We've got to get in there. Again, shame is about failing to live up to public norms, standards, and ideals. And so this is why we see also when we've talked about, the impact of television and Western culture on cultures that didn't have access to TV. There was some studies regarding that, and you see cultures that didn't have TV, then they did have TV, and how eating disorders started to happen. Well, why is that? Well, it's the public norm, the standards and ideals that are perpetuated. So shame really encourages this self-evaluative, like it's a rumination, and it's a degrading rumination, and it pervades all aspects of the self. And so just imagine that. And again, we've all probably had some of this. If you can relate to any of what I'm talking about here, and you've experienced shame and you want to just call it out and be honest and just say, yeah, I can relate. I understand. I try to encourage chat while I'm talking, because when I'm doing webinars, like I'm literally just talking to a computer screen, and I'm like, are there really people there? I'm just like sitting here talking to my computer screen. So yeah, it's always nice to see chat. So if you can relate to this feeling that it's a ubiquitous feeling. I remember some of my earliest experiences of shame, and certainly tied in with that feeling of being flawed. And it's a negatively valent, self-conscious emotion. So how many of you can relate to the experience of shame? Like, so Amanda, thank you for relating to this, and thank you for being brave and being our first participant to say, yes, I understand what shame is like. I've felt shame. We have all felt shames, and it's for better or for worse. And this talk is really about putting a name to it and being able to be more open about it. Because guess what? The more we can share about it, the more we can relate to one another. We can also comfort and soothe one another around our shame. Sometimes we really need that. We need that tender, loving care when we feel that shame, to be able to just be there for each other. Thank you, Jacqueline, for mentioning that you can relate, and thank you, Alyssa, for mentioning that you can relate. And I appreciate you guys for being brave. Thank you so much. So some of the different causes, there's different kind of norms. There's etiquette norms, like being polite, wearing appropriate attire, then there's the moral norms, like not stealing, not lying. And then there's, personal standards, so we can see it with people with eating disorders, this sense of like the personal standards and ideals just being so extreme. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that way that those personal standards and ideals are so extreme. If you talk to people that have like exercise addiction, for example, I was telling you with the food, the person isn't eating because they don't want to feel that shame spiral that they feel if they eat. Well, people with exercise addiction, this is my opinion just based on doing this for 20 years, people with exercise addiction, a lot of times they're doing their pattern of movement because they're trying to escape shame. And if they don't do movement, if they don't go run or do the gym or whatever, the shame kind of like engulfs them. So a lot of times they're given positive reinforcement, like, oh, this is so great, you're doing self-care and blah, blah, blah. Nothing could be further from the truth for a person with exercise addiction. That's why it's such a cluster, blah, blah, blah. The person is like trying to escape a shame spiral. It's not about self-care. It's about like this really deeply embedded shame that and doing this running or whatever gives a temporary like rest from the shame spiral. But it's an addictive thing, because if you haven't dealt with the shame, then you just have to keep running and running and running and running and running, because as soon as you stop, like, it's going to come back. So that's a big kind of way that you see exercise, compulsive exercise tied in with these like very high personal standards that gets kind of sucked into our psyche, internalized. And then we feel like we have to live up to that standard, and we feel shame if we don't. Again, my big brother Mark said it. Shame really sucks. Shame really sucks. We got to help each other. So then there's also an important thing to think about, is that there's a sense of like what the audience is. So it's like, it depends on who's around you, where you might feel shame or you might not feel shame. Like I could probably be called out for something, or somebody could sort of make a little joke about one of my little quirks or whatever. And if I was just home with my friends or peers or something, I'd be like, ha, 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 ha. But, if I was at a dinner or whatever with people I didn't know, I might feel more vulnerable. So when we think about this, I think about it when I think about like schools and like weighing kids and the presidential fitness challenge and all that stuff. Like if I was just hanging out with my friends and I was at the gym and there was like a rope for me to try to climb, I would like climb and I would just like fall on my bottom and I would just laugh and we'd be like, ha, 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 Whereas if you're a kid and I remember as a kid, like those presidential fitness things, and I could never do a pull up, or I just never, ever could do that. I kind of had strong legs, but I didn't have strong arms. And I always felt so embarrassed that I had no way, I felt this shame that I couldn't pull myself up. Oh yeah, Laura, one of the difficulties with feeling shame is that's not commonly discussed feeling. So it goes underground and wreaks havoc. Yes. Oh, Kara, the presidential fitness challenges, they were the worst. Horrible. I love your chats. Thank you for chatting with me so that I don't feel like I'm talking to my computer on this Friday afternoon. And on that subject, though, of the audience can be real or imagined, right? You can also feel a lot of shame just based on like thinking, like I know somebody, one of my friends, he does have like a lot of, I think, core shame, and I might run outside and be wearing my pajamas or something, getting something from my car, and like we have a different perception. He's like, somebody's going to see you out there, like as if, and I'm like, it doesn't, but to him, there's this audience and it's like something I should be ashamed of. To me, I'm like, who cares, So the audience can be real or imagined. So the agent so there's some different kinds of shame that we're going to articulate now, which can be helpful when you're really, really getting into the nitty gritty of thinking about shame. There's some different like kind of types of shame. So the agent center is about the theories that emphasize how commonly held values in a person's community must be embraced by the person, So so if you don't live up to those commonly held values, then you're going to be ashamed. This could be in very religious, households or things of that nature. That we must embrace this, whatever the other, the value is of the other person. So when you have a group-centered view, right, you're not really thinking about yourself from a place of yourself. You're thinking about yourself, I'm saying yourself, like more as a function of your social position and standing. So, if it's not about, okay, I determine my own value. I, Wendy, determine my own value. It's about where am I at, So, please call me Dr. Wendy Oliver-Pyatt. I need that, or versus, being more self-determined, like, please call me Wendy, that kind of thing. Happy to say that. I'd much rather have you call me Wendy. I don't need a label. I don't want a label because it kind of makes us more distant from each other. But that's really a piece of understanding when a person really has that group center viewed. And, you're not standing in your own eyes, you're standing in the eyes of the community, and is very sensitive to the esteem of others. I remember this patient of mine, and it was really, really a take-home message for me. Some of our eating disorder patients have such an intense reaction to feeling like they're not doing what they need to be doing within their community. There was a person that had discharged from my residential program years ago, Reno, Nevada, and she came back into the house I think she had to pick something up or something, and she didn't want to talk to one of the patients who was a current patient. She just needed, and before I was doing an individual session with her, she was so worked up about how am I going to handle it? I'm not going to talk to the person. Is it going to be okay? Blah, blah, blah. And she just felt like she needed to go over and talk to that person, and it seemed like she was okay. And she was so torn up about it. And we did this whole preparation before she went to the house so that she was going to be able to go in the house, get the things she needed, and leave without getting into this conversation. And I really thought I nailed it. We talked about it in the session. Do you know when she went in there, she couldn't do it. She just went right over to the person. She could not do that. And so it was really about what she seemed like to the people there. And if she didn't talk, what would they think? So that's the group-centered view. This is also a very interesting one, which was called recalcitrant shame. It's shame that you experience even if you don't believe in the value. So there's a value out there. You don't really believe in the value, right? But you feel shame. I'm going to use the religion example again, because it's kind of this is nothing against religion, by the way. I'm just using it because it's coming to my mind as an easy example. So maybe I'm not, well, I actually had a patient this way. Her family was very religious. I think they were Seventh-day Adventists, and she didn't believe it. And she had been raised in this way, but as she was getting older, she didn't really buy into it. And so she didn't believe those values, but she felt this recalcitrant shame that she just didn't believe it, but she still felt this sense of shame that she wasn't doing, as she should. So shame and morality, shame mediates between what an agent takes himself to be and then what he is to others. So the feeling of morality and shame kind of has to do with with like maybe hurting other people. So there is actually, and we'll talk more about it, there are some functions of shame, right? In creating social order, there are some functions of shame, which is why, shame exists as an emotion for some reasons. And shame also concerns how the agent relates to himself, his ideas, and his standards. So if we have certain standards, let's say, whatever they may be, and we're not adhering to those, it may affect our sense of self-respect. And this is something that we can use with like acceptance and commitment therapy. We can help people say like, yeah, you might feel this way, and you might feel this way, and you might feel this way. Here, over here is your value, right? This is your value. Wow, what self-respect are you going to have when you're living according to those values? You might feel like you're doing something wrong because you ate, or you might feel, like it's terrible because you wear a different clothing size or whatever. You might feel those ways, but your value is full recovery. Your value is, I'm going against the oppression of diet culture. So really using ACT concepts and relating that to how we help somebody with self-respect can be really, really important, because that shame, sucks people away from that. This is also really interesting from the and on the origin of shame. This is something I learned. So shame and disgust, right? There's this correlation there. And interestingly enough, there's a evolutionary force or reason or survival reason to have a feeling of physical disgust as it relates to the avoidance of social interactions. So when we have these bodily concerns and we avoid social interactions, the theory here is that with these bodily symptoms that we were having was maybe because we were sick. And then there was a sort of evolutionary need to drive us to avoidance. And shame really functions to pull us away from other people. And so that's very interesting. When I was doing this reading about how shame, disgust, and disease avoidance are all potentially intertwined. I had never really thought about it, but I think that also ties in with some of the somatic preoccupation and the shame that we see in eating disorders. We were doing the Weight Stigma Awareness Week, I guess just last week, and we were talking about, body image and shame and living in a larger body and all this stuff. And one of the things that one of the people said in the Impact Council is that people that are living in a larger body, that go into dieting and weight suppression, that they're really just trying to have access. That's what the person said. They're trying to have access. Like they're trying to have access to relationships or jobs or whatever the case may be. And that this idea that it's going to tie in with your social standing. And that's really, really an interesting thing, that that way that shame kind of dovetails into our body image. And what we're really trying to do is get access. So some of the difference between shame and guilt, right? I guess some of you guys may already know a little bit about the difference between I'm sorry, I just opened those up. Those pull-ups were awful. I agree with you, Christy. Christy. Okay, so that's just so funny. I'm sorry. I just had to laugh at that. Okay. So shame versus guilt, put it in the chat. Do you guys intuitively know the difference between shame and guilt? If you do, throw it in there, the chat for me. Make me happy so I know you're there. But the difference really of shame and guilt is really, shame is really like a self-directed moral emotion. And it's like, yeah, exactly, Elizabeth. Guilt is like, I did something wrong. Shame is like the whole self. The whole self is defective. Like it's a feeling of defectiveness. Can you imagine what that's like for our folks, not just with eating disorders, but with other conditions? Like, just think about what it feels like, what it would feel like to feel defective. And I know times when I've felt ashamed, like, oh, I screwed something up. Oh my God. And then I just start to feel so bad, like, oh my God. And it can kind of get into that self as a whole feeling. And like, it's so painful that people really, really have to defend it in some way. And so that's where eating disorder behavior, addiction, can come in to actually placate. And Amanda, yeah, and Lauren said, I did something versus I am something, I am wrong versus doing something wrong. And that's exactly the difference there. And then shame culture is a sort of same kind of idea. And, we have this shame culture around our bodies. Our bodies are just not acceptable as is, which is just terrible, absolutely terrible way to exist. And this is what you guys just said. I am a bad person, or I did a bad thing. So when they surveyed some college students, they identified causes of shame kind of as to failing to perform well in exams, hurting others, not behaving in accordance with rules, failing to meet expectations of other, and not fulfilling one's duties. So those are just some of the information we'll talk about a little bit. Brene Brown, some of her studies around shame and what people reported in just a minute. So this is just like my little tangent here, which is just some stuff that I've thought about when people, have more of a propensity towards either shame or guilt as just sort of an innate temperamental aspect of themselves, because these temperamental features of ourself are genetically mediated and culturally, exacerbated. So, I'm going to start with altruism. So altruism is a genetically mediated trait, and it's actually seen even at a cellular level. So that sense of I will forfeit for myself, for the needs of others. And this is a temperamental personality kind of feature that some people are sort of born more with than others. Doesn't mean that people that have less altruism are less great of people, but just there are people who are just more altruistic than others, because there's a spectrum of everything. So what I've actually noticed in eating disorder patients is that, there's a lot of those eating disorder patients who also are vegetarian and vegan. And a lot of times people say, oh, it's because they're eating disorder. That's why, that's why they're vegetarian. That's why they're vegan. They just don't want to eat the meat and things of that nature. But I think when you talk to a lot of people that have eating disorders, you find that they are very altruistic in their nature, and their temperament is to forfeit their needs over the needs of some other creature, which of course, eating disorders really in and of themselves are about not being able to attend to your basic needs. At the end of the day, it's like you're not meeting your need for, your most basic human need is food. So not tending to your own needs, right? Forfeiting your own needs over others. And so I think with this temperamental feature of altruism, there is a lean in toward vegetarianism and veganism. So it's a little bit of a side note on that. But a person who has this altruistic temperament and really begins to think about animals as they get a little bit older, or they've seen animals be hurt and that sort of thing, it's really like a very overwhelming feeling of shame that can come about. It could be shame or guilt, depending on how they internalize it. But I think we do really a disservice to people to just assume that if the person doesn't want to eat, the person with the eating disorder doesn't want to eat meat, that, oh, they're just trying to get away with their eating disorder. And I also think that people who have more tendency towards altruism are also the type that in general have more shame, because when you're altruistic, you feel this like high standard of self-sacrifice. Like, I need to make my kids, God bless my kids. They are tall. They refuse to put their seat back on an airplane. They're like, I can't possibly put my seat back on the airplane. Oh my God, I can't do that. Oh my God. Like, they would just feel so ashamed if they were to put their seat back on the airplane. Like, they're better than me. I get on the plane and I'm like, I need to put my seat back. It's like, I'm sure I do look at the person behind me, but that feeling of like that shame that's tied in with like, I've got to forfeit for the need of the others. I mean, it's nice that they care about other people. So I'm proud of them. But I think really talking about the connection between temperamental features such as altruism and the connection between more higher risk of experiencing shame. If you're more altruistic, you are kind of more vulnerable to feeling shame. And you might be more likely to want to be a vegetarian or a vegan. And then there's guilt, right? So guilt is, again, these are two emotions, shame and guilt, you see, in eating disorders. And I think as it relates to, and these are just, some frameworks. There could be, this is a kind of black and white way I'm explaining it, but like it can be a lot of crossover. You might feel some shame and some guilt, or you might have, it's not just like this or that. I'm just using this as like a way to speak about it. So it's not like an exact thing that I'm describing here, but in people who've been associated with trauma, or deprivation, I see this a lot of times in people who have immigrated, for example, or who, have family members in one country who are under a great amount of stress and they're here, in a better place, or even kids that are like doing really well. And like a parent might have, a condition or a struggle. And there's this feeling of guilt, like, wow, like I'm just, what makes me deserve this, happiness and this, one of the things I tell parents, like, the very best thing you can do for your kids is like be okay in yourself. Because of course we parents, we're always wanting to help our kids and make them feel better, and myself for sure included in that. And I have to remind myself the very best thing I can do for my kids is take good care of myself so they can go out and feel good about taking care of themselves. So sometimes we have this guilt, and it gets translated into guilt about even taking up space that we see, in eating disorders. So any other comments about that? And I can't see the chat now for some reason. So can't tell if you're saying anything about that. So, going on a little bit about shame and eating disorders is that we live in this society of like, no pain, no gain is like the mindset of our communities, which is just so wrong. Our society tries to white knuckle people and shame them into health. And it's just a really terrible thing. That ties in, of course, with the subject of weight stigma. And, I spend a lot of time, thinking about weight stigma, because weight stigma and shame are very intertwined. And weight stigma is prevalent in our society. It's socially reinforced. Any form of a person with an eating disorder or disordered eating is going to have internalized weight stigma, whether you're living in a lower than sort of average size body or more average size or like higher weight body. There's like this internalized, shame. And then, but what happens when you are in a larger size body is that it's not just like the internalized shame that we may have when living in any body. When we're in a larger body, we actually get oppressed. We feel oppression in addition to the internalized weight stigma. So it's really a double whammy. And when somebody experiences weight stigma, it's because they're experiencing a form of discrimination. So weight stigma is a socially sanctioned form of discrimination that's reinforced in authoritative institutions, ranging from government institutions to schools to medical providers. And it's a reflection of internalized attitudes about body size that affects how a person treats other people. And it's stereotypical, it's stereotypes. It's exuding, it is discrimination, and the stigmatized person develops a devalued social identity. Weight stigma is terrible. It's pervasive, it's normative in our society, and it's reinforced by authoritative social institutions. This is at the heart of eating disorders. And one of the reasons, and disordered eating, and just normative discontent, just feeling unhappy and miserable with your body. So weight stigma is a huge problem in our society, and I really want to do something about it. I want to help. I am very committed to, that's why we do Weight Stigma Awareness Week, because I want it to be that someday it's like normative for people to know what weight stigma is. I want it to be someday where doctors know when they're doing weight, when they're stigmatizing their patient. Like a patient comes in, because they have a torn rotator cuff, and they go out, of the office with a diet. One of my lovely relatives that lives in a larger body, people can be so avoidant of doctors because doctors are the number two, perpetrator of weight stigma, is that, well, some people just don't go to the doctor because they know that's coming. And what she said, her adaptive response is that she goes to the doctor, but she gets in there really fast and says like, I know I need to lose weight. I know, so please, like, she doesn't want to feel the infliction of the weight stigma. So she tries to sort of say it first to try to get that person to like sort of back off and leave her alone. I think it's even more than 40% that experience weight stigma, but that's what the Pool et al. In 2020 found. And more than 50% of adolescents reported increased exposure to weight stigmatizing experiences on social media during the pandemic, which I think didn't help at all. And then, of course, weight-based bullying is more common type of bullying than any other type of bullying. Weight-based bullying is it. And I would say that we live, in an epidemic of self-hate toward our body. And that is about normative discontent, the normalization of this self-hate. We were talking a little bit about weight, bullying, trauma, and shame. So, being in a larger weight body, and by the way, where it says overweight, that should have quotes around it, my bad. But there's a direct tie between size and being bullied for sure. And what's insane about it, as is that when somebody experiences like the stigmatizing experience, which is really a stigmatizing experience, is like a bullet of shame. It's like a bullet just came at you and just like hit you. It's a bullet of shame. And it's painful. And it's sort of like, I'm just thinking out loud here, sort of like one of those bullets that gets inside of you and then it like explodes inside of you. That's what weight stigma does. That's a way I would maybe describe it. And so it's overwhelming. And so what ends up happening is that the person is flooded. So they may then go to other ways to help them manage that alcohol use, like suicidality, difficulty sleep, eating more food, social avoidance, decreased social activity, reduced trust in healthcare providers. So I was actually with a couple of doctors that really didn't know much about this. I was at the Florida Psychiatric Association, and they were like, but what do you mean, Wendy? Like, how can we, these people come into our office and, they live in these bodies that are, and like, we got to tell them, that they're, and like, we need to put them on a diet, and it was just kind of ironic because right before that part of the conversation, we had this whole other conversation about how important it is for people to connect with their patients. And so because medical providers are trained like, this thing is this terrible thing. They never talk about eating disorders or weight cycling. It's just like, And they don't really connect the dot that when they perpetuate weight stigma, they're actually creating a barrier to connectivity. The person feels like bullet, going in, and then there's a wall that is in existence between the self and the other. So that experience of weight stigma creates a barrier of connection. So that is why it's so ineffective for people to tell you, what to do, how much to eat, that sort of thing. So Brene Brown did some studies, a lot of studies actually, on shame. And they were able to identify these 200 participants were able to identify these different categories of shame, but body shame was the one that 90% of the people reported. And it really affects, how we love, how we work, how we parent, how we communicate, how we build relationships. I think we were just talking about sexuality in the previous talk, and like body shame affects sexuality as well. So as mentioned, over 90% of the participants in Brene Brown's, had the body shame. We talked a little bit about the individualized versus the contextualized shame experiences. So I'm going to keep going through that. So John Bradshaw has a great book called Healing the Shame That Binds You. And he talks also about healthy shame. I thought that was interesting. So I wanted to mention like healthy shame, how he describes it is that it's sort of kind of, in a sense, it's sort of, in my mind, it's sort of about humility. Like we call it healthy, and he calls it healthy inferiority. And sort of that allows us to sort of say, hey, that person may know more than me, and that's okay. You have to be able to hold yourself up to say that. Or healthy guilt is like, hey, you feel guilt if you do this like behavior. Like if you hurt somebody, you might feel, some guilt about it. So he even goes on to say that it might also connect to creativity, generativity, and learning, because it sort of makes us slow down a little bit and have more awe and reverence for what else is around us, and can even give us a sense of spirituality when we sort of see this thing that's bigger or more than we are, rather than just sort of, I guess the opposite, of shame is like arrogance, right? So I think this is what he's talking about when he thinks about this healthy shame. I would say it's sort of like not being arrogant is another way to think about it. I think that's what he was trying to get at when he talked about, that's how I interpret it when because I was like, when I first read about this, like, what is he talking about? Healthy shame, So, what, the life damaging shame that really takes us to where we're miserable and we have to cope in these unhealthy ways. And it's true sickness of the soul, as he calls it. That is like not what we're aiming for. So he talks about healthy shame more as a part of keeping us sort of, I guess you could say, keeping us in check a little bit might be a way. Oh, and yeah, I was making that point. It's rooted in humility too. It kind of, as mentioned, it gives you that yellow light. It sort of says, yeah, we're not perfect. We make mistakes. It makes us sort of be in touch with what our limits are. And that can be good to know what our limits are. So we can integrate, we can use our energy in things that we should be using it for. So that's kind of how he talks about healthy shame. And I remember like the idea that it sort of slows us down. And then as a state of being is the unhealthy way John Bradshaw talks about it. And this is really coming about of abusive experiences, narcissistic deprivation, sexual abuse. So, I'll talk a little bit about narcissistic, deprivation here. And this is where we talk about a little bit of like invalidating environments. And, what kind of happens is the person is like, chronically deprived. And that child begins to think, oh, it's not, I'm deprived because there's somebody over there that's not giving to me, who's limited. It's like, I'm deprived because I don't deserve it. I'm not a worthy person. I don't deserve it. And that's where, abandonment trauma can also, tie in. And certainly sexual abuse brings around that disgust and that feeling of unhealthy shame, which is just such a painful, terribly complicated state to be faced with, and is certainly my distinct honor, I will say, for the past 20 years of working with individuals who've suffered in that way, and helping them release the shame is probably one of the most meaningful, personal experiences of my life. This is also from John's book. And what I think is just kind of interesting about this is that the idea of shame-bound control and then shame-bound release, like it's sort of, you can't get away with it. You can't be too tied up for too long and too tight until there's a sort of release as well. Because the control can only last so long. And then there's the release, and then there's the release, and then there's the shame around the release. And then we go back to the control, and that's basically what happens, in eating disorders. There's excessive control that leads to the release. And then there's this shame around the release, and we go back to the control. People live and die going through that. Another important point is that rage and anger can be a secondary reaction. So one of the things we notice is that when people are experiencing shame, right, sometimes they get into a rage or like some of us might have experienced that in a relationship, or if like maybe with your kids or something, you say something and they feel shame, and then they just and they're really pushing back. And part of that really is to protect themselves from further exposure to that shaming, experience. And it does alienate you because it keeps you away from those other people that are inducing the shame. But that anger and rage is really can be thought of as a secondary reaction. So when we see that, in our treatment, we can remind ourselves, we might see the anger and the rage, and we might want to be reminded that what could be the buried emotion there. I'm thinking about how much time we have left. We have about 10 more minutes. I will just continue on for about 5 minutes and we'll open up to some talk. So the shame bind, I'm going to talk about the shame bind. So the shame bind is something Kaufman talks about. He's a really good, important writer. And he talks about the 6 basic interpersonal needs that we have. And when we don't get these needs met, we actually feel like those needs, the little child feels like it's wrong to have the need. And there's a shame bind that happens. So rather than if the need isn't fulfilled, there's this sense of like this need was too much. Like rather than the environment wasn't able to fill that need, this and this is adaptive in a sense. Like if you're in an environment that's not adaptive in the sense of like just survival, like if I'm in an environment and like I'm not getting my needs met, eventually it's sort of like the shame comes in and just sort of says, well, shut up then, quit trying. It's sort of a way to shut you down so you're not just constantly sort of like going back for more and more and more. So we need to feel loved and wanted. Shame occurs when a child fails to experience that in a relationship. We need to be touched and held. It's a biological need. Shame is felt when touching and holding is withheld or abusive. There's a need for identification, a personal culture. That my kids see what I do, or maybe they come to a dinner and they see, this is what my mom does, or she helps people with mental health. And that makes, that's kind of cool or whatever. But when I don't let them into my personal world and there's secrecy around that can actually cause withdrawal and shame. Differentiation, we see this a lot in people with trauma because everybody's just hanging on so tightly because everybody's been so eating disorders where there's been trauma, first and second generation trauma. And so there's a difficult time sometimes with that differentiation step. And there's can be some shame, upon needing that separation and individuation. Also, we need to be able to nurture. So if we're not able to nurture, if we say, Mom, I want to give you a hug, and Mom's like, I'm busy right now, this sort of thing. We want to give, but we want to receive, but we also want to give. And then affirmation. We all have a need to have affirmation. I want to be able to tell my kids, like, you are the bomb, and I naturally believe this. I really do believe it. But, in some cases, kids don't get that feeling. And it's this fracture in the interpersonal bridge because there's an emotional bond that ties us together and involves trust, vulnerability, and openness when I have this need. But then when that need's not met, there's this disruption. That's what I was talking about in the doctor's office. So this is what's happening when the needs are not being taken or responded to appropriately by a significant other. And so this is where internalized shame actually comes from. And it has to do with when our needs aren't understood or openly acknowledged. And the way this kind of works into our identity is that it's internalized. Identity forms through 3 dimensions. It can be based on what other people say, what they actually say. And that's how you internalize like feelings and beliefs about yourself. It's how they're treated. The way I treat you, it leads to an internalization. And then there's also images that can be incorporated and internalized within yourself, which can be unconscious. So I'm going to, we have 7 minutes. I'm not going to go too far into shame binds. We talked about altruism. I think just one thing I will say about, eating and shame is that when we are very shame bound, we are very in conflict of ourself when we're eating. We're sort of like, I should or shouldn't, I should or shouldn't, I shouldn't, I should. So this actually creates a disconnect within yourself, as you're eating. And so shame and being dissociated when you eat are very connected. So in order to be mindful when you eat, we really have to dig into the shame, because the shame fractures that bridge within ourselves. We cannot be present with ourselves when we're eating, when we're experiencing this like heavy duty shame. It causes this need to dissociate. So we end up eating, but we have this dissociation when we're eating, and that leads to that mindless feeling. And this really just talks about a little bit about when we were talking about the interpersonal needs not being met and the identification and the self-shame. So the person's needs aren't met, that results in self-shame. Then our culture really drives that self-shame into body shame. And that body shame drives this into restriction, and then restriction drives dysregulation with food, binge purge, or restriction. And then, when the eating disorder behavior happens, then you have more guilt and shame. And this is what I call the shame cycle in eating disorders. And it is culturally mediated. Those are like things that exacerbate it, but it does start with interpersonal needs not being met. And that sort of ties in with our culture. If we feed shame, the secrecy and silence it craves, we keep the struggles with our bodies buried within it, and the shame will fester and grow. From Brene Brown. And then lastly, I'll just leave with sort of a nugget, is that I consider, any kind of art. This is from The Art of Loving. Fromm talks about concentration, knowledge, respect, and discipline to be needed for any art. So I say, okay, he's talking about art. I'm talking about the art of loving, or the art of mindful living. And basically, the more we concentrate on ourselves, and that's sort of the mindfulness piece, we begin to know each other. We begin to know ourselves better. The more we know about ourselves, let's say we're shame bound, or we blame ourselves, or we feel guilt because we live in this culture that tries to make us think we're not okay when we are okay. So the more we know ourselves, the more respect we start to have. Like, hey, I'm actually not so bad after all. I actually deserve this, or this. That respect then leads to discipline. And Fromm talks about discipline in the Eastern versus Western, which that Eastern definition is like, we do things because not doing it would feel crappy. So it's like, I'm going to do yoga because I want to do yoga. It's going to feel good to go do it. But it's not because it's Thursday and I must do it in this time. And I need to do it for this many minutes. And let me see how many calories I burned on my watch. That's externally mediated, exercise. This kind of discipline he's talking about is doing things because if you didn't do it, you would sort of hunger for it and miss it. And that kind of discipline leads back to concentration. So when we're able to engage in this way with ourselves, it leads to concentration, which again leads back to more of this. And this is sort of the positive cycle. I call it choosing the loving behavior when we get on this cycle. And of course, destruction is sort of the opposite of all of that. The opposite of concentration or mindfulness is mindlessness. The opposite of knowledge is ignorance. The opposite of respect is contempt. The opposite of discipline is chaos. So I try to teach this. And so wherever we're more vulnerable, maybe we have more likelihood to get off this cycle because we get into contempt, or we get into ignorance around ourselves, or we lose touch with what it means to be, engaging in self-care. So we have to kind of see where our natural drift is and kind of pay attention to the cycle and how we're fueling ourselves and how this cycle is going, because we don't want this cycle. And shame resilience involves acknowledging personal vulnerability, being aware, reaching out, and really speaking about shame. Regardless of size, shape, and despite the burden of shame, we all deserve to enjoy food. We all deserve to enjoy our relationship with ourselves. And I will leave it at that. Can't believe I did that. 2 minutes ago.
You did it.
I did it.
And if you can see the chat, we do have comments. We have a really great comment from Robert. Shame is fear of criticism, and there are many defenses which people have to avoid emotion about it. And avoidance keeps people from knowing what their shame beliefs are and prevents them from challenging them. Very often goes back generations and passed along in families. Children do not have a choice about what they're taught, and don't talk about them. People can learn to tolerate having and expressing strong emotions and find out they do not last so long and will not destroy them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Robert, for that. This is our last moment of our Within Health Summit 2023.
Yes, it is.
Jamie, it's been wonderful. I appreciate everybody who joined us throughout the week. Thank you guys so much for being here this week, and thank you for being here for my talk on shame today. I hope it meant something to you. I hope that whatever you might feel shame about, you'll like take it and like write it down, and crumble it up on a piece of paper and just like throw that thing somewhere, and release your shame. Talk about it with somebody, invite somebody to talk about their shame. It came about for a reason, but we got to make sure that we're processing it and not controlled by it. And I think it permeates through a lot of areas of our life. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it today at our summit. And I couldn't be more grateful than more lucky than I am. And I'm grateful beyond words for all the people that are here today. I really appreciate, all of you. I'm just looking through the names. Thank you guys for being here. I see your names, and I appreciate you so very, very, very much. I think it's a wrap, Jamie.
It is a wrap. And Dr. Pyatt said it best. We appreciate all of you. I just want to give a huge shout out to my colleagues at Within Health for a week long of amazing presentations, and everyone that was working feverishly behind the scenes to make sure that we pulled this summit off. Again, this is just our second summit. And so we're looking forward to the Within Health Summit 2024 so that it continues to grow, and that you all continue to learn and we continue to collaborate together. Thank you so much.
If people have ideas for things they want to hear about at the summit next year too, please send them to Jamie. We love your ideas and feedback.
We absolutely do. Thank you, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Bye.